everyone, to another episode of Hawk Off the Press. I'm Madison Hricik. I am the Iowa football beat reporter for the Gazette. And before I introduce our guest, I just want to say one quick giant thank you message to everybody who has been incredibly supportive and has donated to Project Slow Miles over the last month and a half. It was a massive success. Jeff Linder and I were so excited for the number of people that were wearing Project Slow Miles t-shirts as we ran our half marathon, and for our team relay that did incredible as well. So thank you guys so much. Everybody that participated, that cheered us on. It was an incredible event. We're so happy that it worked out, and we are so thankful for all of your support. So we can't wait to share more about that, but truly from the bottom of all of our hearts, before we get really into the weeds of this episode, I wanted to make sure I started things off with a massive thank you. But now, a guest that I am very excited about because he's a very good friend of mine. I'm so excited to introduce Sports Business Journal's Ben Portnoy, not to be confused or have any relation with Dave Portnoy, as you and I have made multiple jokes about. Yep. But Ben, it has been a long time since you and I have had a good chat. Welcome to the show.
What's going on? No, this is great. I'm glad to do this, and no shortage of things to talk about. So I'm glad we get to line up and do this.
Yes, it's about time. I think I texted you a month ago and was like, all right, things have finally slowed down. When can we talk? And then things did not slow down.
Yep. So it's been a crazy couple of weeks, but listen, it's as much as people like to think it's the off season for college sports, it seems like increasingly the off season's busier than the actual season.
Well, especially when you have your job, specifically when you're doing all college athletics. Like some of us beat reporters have a little bit of reprieve, especially in the month of June. I think it's a little bit more early July the reprieve happened. That's just my opinion, though. But I mean, with all of the spring meetings, you were just in Vegas a couple days ago. Like you've been everywhere doing all of the things, and I don't envy your travel schedule, but I do envy the amount of airline points that you probably have.
American Airlines and I are very familiar. I'll say that much.
Sure. All right. So your biggest role with Sports Business Journal is not only necessarily just understanding just yourself what's going on with college athletics, but making sure it's understandable for the average fan, because as we've seen, particularly in the last few days, a lot has gone on and a lot of things are changing. So let's start with maybe a little bit more of the legislation side of things, and then we'll start talking about some of the more recent events. But Senator Cruz has been very active about trying to put forward some sort of bill to Congress about creating limitations, just kind of more so than anything else, putting restrictions on college athletics in terms of revenue share, all of these kinds of things. In your Spark Notes version of this, how is this bill or this proposed bill going to be effective, if it is going to be effective?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, it's a big if this thing gets through Congress. I think it's important. Well, we'll get there in a second, but I think that there's a couple of things that this basically does. Essentially, it grants the College Sports Commission, which was created out of the House settlement and is essentially sort of the clearinghouse for NIL deals, and the NCAA and others to basically it sort of empowers them to be able to actually make rules and create rules, and certainly that's not something that's going particularly well at the moment, and that coming from federal law would certainly help. The other pieces of this that I think are really important is it would create, at least as it's written right now, and it may not stay this way, is that it would include sort of protections around sort of a super league formation. It would allow for the pooling of media rights. So the idea that, for example, in college sports, every different league has their own set of media rights. The Big Ten has its deal with Fox and CBS and NBC. The SEC has its deal with ESPN. But in the NFL, right, the NFC East and the NFC West don't have different TV contracts. That's the theory being that if you bundle everything together, it's worth more money. This would allow you to do that, and the NFL can do that because it has an antitrust exemption from Congress. Thanks to the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. College sports does not have that. This would allow them to do that. However, I would say it's important to note, realistically, this is a really, really tight time frame for this to be done. So this got introduced basically, 2 weeks ago now, basically. While I was at SEC spring meetings, so it's been an eventful couple of travel weeks for me, things dropping out of the blue in the middle of all of these. But This got dropped about 2 weeks ago, and I think it's important to note is that we're sitting here in June, almost the middle of June, which is crazy. Congress will have some time off around the 4th of July. They're on recess for the month of August, and then you come back in September. And then once you get to October, you're basically a month out from midterms, so people are campaigning and things along those lines. So we're really only talking about a 3-ish month window here to get anything done. And in congressional speeds, that's lightning fast. I mean, this is crazy quick. I think that's why I and others have a little bit of skepticism that this will ultimately get voted on in the Senate, let alone get through the Senate. But I think it's something that, is obviously top of mind for a lot of administrators and legislators and everything else.
Well, considering you were at SEC spring meetings when this was first introduced, the SEC has already been, and the Big Ten as well, have been pretty vocal about this. When this came out, what was a lot of the initial conversation from SEC athletic directors, from Sankey? Just what did anybody have any initial reactions that you were able to talk to them about at all?
Yeah, I think, look, there's, when these bills come out, right, especially in their early stages, the reality is 100% of what's in the bill now is not, if this thing were to ever get ratified and voted on, it's not going to look like it looks like right now. It's going to get things tacked on, it's going to have things cut out, so on and so forth. I think the general sentiment that I gleaned from people then and over the last couple of weeks is if say 60-65% of the stuff that is in this bill is still in it by the time it would get to a vote or to a ratification, that's a really good thing for college sports. I think it would allow for creating some structure, some rulemaking, some decision making, things of that nature. That said, I mean, the Big Ten and the SEC, I think, feel targeted, I guess, for lack of a better term, by some of the language in this bill. And I mentioned it, there's rules and regulations that would basically stipulate, if your league made over $1 billion in revenue this year, which is the Big Ten and the SEC, you wouldn't be basically allowed to create a super league, or it would protect against conference expansion. The pooling of media rights is a similar thing. Like I just mentioned, in theory, the value goes up if you put everyone together, but the Big Ten and the SEC have a huge advantage over everyone right now because of the way that the deals are structured, and their deals are worth so much more than everyone else's. So that's not something that they're necessarily in favor of. The Big Ten's been pretty vocal that this is not something that they're going to support, at least as it's currently written. Same thing with the SEC. Now, there's been meetings between lawmakers and Senator Cruz and Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington, who's co-sponsor of this. This is a bipartisan bill, so I think that's important to note. But there's been some meetings between Big Ten administrators and presidents and chancellors and things like that with those lawmakers. Same thing with the SEC. So we'll see. My understanding is there's going to be a markup of this bill here sometime in the next couple of weeks. Maybe it's next week. Maybe it's 3 weeks. We're not totally sure. But there are folks trying to move on this quickly. It's just a matter of whether the clock runs out too quickly.
Yeah, and you had said 3 months-ish is kind of the time frame we're looking at before. I mean, it's just not going to happen this year, if at all. It just, as you mentioned, that is extremely fast in any sort of legislative standpoint. With the initial reaction from the Big Ten and the SEC, how much does that even hinder just the timeline for the ability for this to get moved forward if you're looking at two major conferences that, as of right now, are not the biggest fans of this proposed setup?
I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic, and I talked to some people about this in Vegas and elsewhere. It's pretty rare or non-existent really for the two leagues that would be most effective, for the two people who would be most affected by congressional legislation to not be in favor of said legislation by the time it is introduced to the House or to the Senate. And so it's sort of this weird dynamic where college sports has been wanting and clawing for congressional legislation for years. I mean, decades really at this point. And the two people that would be most affected, the Big Ten and the SEC, are against it. And so it's a little bit of I think there's a little bit of I told you so going on here with administrators, where it's well, you're getting what you wanted. You got federal legislation introduced. It just may not be what you thought you wanted out of it. And so I think there's a little bit of sort of, letting the fox into the hen house type thing here. But we'll see. I think that, again, I'm a little skeptical. I think that, there's obviously politics at play. will the Democrats side in a bipartisan agreement to give, this is something that President Trump has been a big proponent of. Are Democrats going to want to give him a victory sort of right ahead of midterms that, in theory, the Democrats may end up flipping the House? Maybe not. I think these are things that are going on, and certainly these are the politics at play when it comes to something like this beyond just college sports. So it's a really fascinating dynamic, and again, the time frame is pretty quick. So I would expect some more news out of it in the coming weeks, though.
Yeah, you've already been pretty on top of a lot of these things. One question I will say, I know that we focus a lot on the Big Ten in Iowa because, well, that is my job here. But part of the Gazette also does cover Iowa State, and that includes the Big 12. So how do conferences like the Big 12, like the ACC, and even some of these smaller, maybe even FCS programs, how are those schools also impacted by this bill? Maybe I'm assuming that would mean it would be a little bit more positively, from my understanding, unless I'm misinterpreting here.
Yeah, it would. And I think it would institute, something that's really important as part of this bill is that it would reinstitute the 1 year transfer portal, 1 year transfer policy. So you'd get one free transfer and then you would have to sit out after that. It would also open the door to this sort of age-based eligibility, or 5 and 5 is kind of the nickname it's gotten, but age-based eligibility is really what it is and what the NCAA is sort of calling it, where it would effectively sort of create, rather than just saying you have 4 years and it going off of that, it would be based off your age, and basically your clock starting at 19 years old, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. It's either 19 years 19. Old, you enroll in school, first enroll in school, you would have 5 years to play. 5 years, whatever happens in that 5 years is what it is. Those are all parts of the bill. I think all of those things that most of those schools would be in favor of. I think that would be a huge help for a lot of the smaller schools, especially the ones that are getting players poached all the time. But it does become an interesting dynamic at play. So I think those things would help. But again, I don't know that the SEC and Big Ten are necessarily going to support this if some of the other things that are written in here continue to be. But we'll see.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned 5 and 5. So let's talk a little bit about that too. That's a big topic of conversation. I've noticed that, and this is where, again, it goes back to the Big Ten, maybe some schools not being the biggest fan of it, but the NHL, National Hockey League, has come out and said they don't support 5 and 5 because it directly impacts their player development program. Hockey is unique in its own way and how they draft players right before they go to college. They have the ability to play college, and then get signed early. But when you look at other avenues to professional sports, the NFL, MLB, NBA, WNBA, now softball is expanding into a massive professional league as well. How does 5 and 5 potentially impact player development, maybe outside the hockey world, in terms of getting them to reach the next level if they're talented enough to get there?
Yeah. So as you were talking, I was trying to find it because, excuse me, the NCAA kind of clarified its stance on this, and hockey was one of the particularly loud sort of groups of folks coming out against the way the rule was written initially. But basically that the way that the NCAA rule would change if it were to go into effect would be an athlete's eligibility clock would begin upon their initial full-time enrollment in college or at the beginning of the academic year following their 19th birthday, whichever occurs first. So, for example, you mentioned hockey, right? If a kid goes and plays semi-pro hockey for 2 years and comes in at 20 years old or something like that, he would still have 3 years to play college hockey. He just would lose those first 2 he would lose 1 year because he turned 19. So he would have 4 years to play. So I think that it's sort of a way to build that in a little bit to allow for some flexibility. But I think the idea is, and I think that, look, for all of the court cases that the NCAA has lost over the last 15, 20 years, really 25 years, eligibility is one that they generally have had a pretty decent batting average on. And have won a lot of these cases in state court. And so I think that there's a general understanding of look, college sports is college sports, right? We don't need 35-year-old dudes from, Eastern Europe playing for, Colorado or whatever, right? I think that there's a general belief in that from people in the court system and otherwise. And I think that this rule would be set up to sort of help protect against that.
Right. And you're also looking at scenarios where, because a lot of the eligibility stuff where you had 7, 8, even, there's some cases it feels like there was cases where people were in college for a decade almost. But a lot of that did stem from the pandemic in 2020. and the NCAA providing eligibility back to athletes who lost it because of the pandemic in 2020 and in 2021. So those certainly played into a factor, and it seems that this 5-5 is now becoming a way to regain some control after the NCAA kind of doled out a lot of additional eligibility to athletes from when the world shut down, basically.
Yeah, and I think too, like, I think the biggest problem, and I think the biggest problem with eligibility in general has been the waiver process, or among the biggest issues has been the waiver process. This would be a way to sort of get rid of that, right? Like, essentially that you've got, and this has been the case forever in college sports, and we're certainly seeing it right now, is like people don't want the rules to apply to them until they apply to them. And so I think that like there's been a lot of conversation around like, that there's basically, it's a really short turnaround for people file waivers. They hope they get extra eligibility. They're subjectively applied. People get mad in how they're applied. Like, this would basically get rid of that process. Like, you look back a couple of years ago, North Carolina is a really good example. Like, Mac Brown, when he was the head coach of North Carolina, was one of the biggest proponents of cutting off waivers and there being less waivers involved in the transfer portal process. Well, Tez Walker, who was the transfer receiver at UNC, had his waiver denied a couple of times. And, he and AD Bubba Cunningham were ready to burn down the NCAA over it. And so it's like there's this hypocrisy in all of that, which, certainly we're seeing today in a lot of other spaces. But I think the idea with this age-based eligibility would be that you take a little bit of that subjectivity out and you say, hey, look, everyone's got 5 years from this time to this time. And if you play 1 year, or, if you play 5 years, awesome. If you play 5 years, if you play 5 years, awesome. If you play 1 year, then, sorry, you're kind of SOL and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, and some of it too is also it forces athletes to take a look at the schools that they're playing at and their playing capabilities. What are they prioritizing too? Underlying rule, that there's an underlying element to it. Obviously, each athlete has their own determination of how they want to go about everything. Let's stay on the topic of bigger things, but things that Iowa fans are very passionate about right now, and something that you've been on top of because, well, it's been the talk of college sports the last couple of days, and that is Brendan Sorsby finding out that getting the litigation that he is eligible for the 2026 season with Texas Tech after it coming out that he was ruled ineligible for his gambling addiction. This one hits home for Iowa and Iowa State fans massively. I've seen it everywhere. I was not covering the school at the time, but I remember seeing the news about Noah Shannon coming out and things like that. As you followed this, the Sorsby news, what have you made of a lot of this?
There's a lot of people.
A loaded question. I'm sorry.
Right? I would say that, look, there are a lot of people who are mad as hell. And I think that, you look at administrators, presidents, whatever, like people are ticked off, basically different levels of ticked off at this entire thing. I think there's two important things. I think one, as it relates to the Iowa case, like the NCAA was in the process of slimming down its like gambling rules. So such that, Noah Shannon, for example, I think bet one time on a Iowa women's basketball game. And under the previous rules, they were super draconian and that he had lost a year of eligibility over that. Under the new rules, that would not be the case. It would be a smaller, I think it's like a 3-game suspension for something like that. I might have that off, but it's something to that effect. Like, it's been slimmed down, but he was essentially, when it happened, he was punished under the old rules. The current rules, that said, the pretty much one thing that you're not allowed to do is bet on your own team while you're on the team. Well, Brendan Sorsby did that, and then Texas Tech and his lawyers found, his lawyers found a judge that was willing to say, hey, actually, you should be able to play. And so I think it's a real problem. I mean, I think, look, like we can be really hyperbolic in college sports and everything's a turning point and everything's whatever, but like this is a crisis level problem. And I think it is something that, you lose. If he is allowed to play, you are losing the integrity of the game. And I think that is where a lot of people net out on this. And, everyone I've talked to has been really, really irritated, really, really mad, frankly, over this. And I think that it's, it's a complicated process and a complicated thing as far as like what happens next. But I think people are really frustrated because this is sort of like, forget the fact that schools are trying to work in creative ways and work around the rules and tampering with people and trying to figure out creative ways to pay people. Like, that's one thing. Like, everyone looked at this as like, this is the one rule that is ironclad and you don't break it. And a school has broken it and is choosing to ignore that. And I think that that's why people are so ticked off.
Well, and I think one thing that was mentioned to me, I not even mentioned, I think I saw it online. I'm not sure who said it, but somebody had posted on Twitter. It feels like it's reached a point where with something like this, anybody could go bet on their own team, bet on themselves, even in some cases. And if they get caught, they just find somebody who's willing to find a judge who's willing to just say, yeah, I'll work with you. But I mean, we can talk again. We could talk about the hyperbolic side of it and the emotions that are certainly involved in a lot of people's perspectives. But you've said it, like the word precedent has been thrown around a lot, but it does set a precedent here. And I'm curious. I know we don't offer a lot of opinions here when it comes to our job. We try to keep our opinions to ourselves, but I'm going to put a little bit of a hot seat on you here, Ben. But I mean, how does this maybe even infuriate other players? So, because this is, I mean, I still remember in high school when I was being recruited at the Division III level, being told like, in my little like pocket when you're like learning about the school and everything, and it tells you like compliance and all of this stuff, and it's like sports betting not allowed. And I was recruited 2018 2019 for college athletics, and so granted, I know that shows that I'm a little bit on the younger side of things, and that's fine, but I'm curious, I mean, how does this continue to set that precedent that people have mentioned so many times?
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think that I don't know what the right answer is, but like I will say is like, I don't know, when I was reading this and sort of making some calls the other day and after it's a funny story actually. I had gone, this is the less glamorous versions of sports writing, I suppose, but like I had gotten up, I woke up early, I was in Vegas, I got in on like a midnight flight because my flight was delayed, still on East Coast time, so I woke up super early. I went on a run, just like I went from like one end of the strip to the other. And back. So like a little like 3-4 mile loop. Cause I was like, all right, if I don't leave the hotel today, I will not leave the hotel for 3 days basically. Cause that's how it goes in Vegas. And, I get back and I've got like 100 notifications on my phone. I'm like, what on earth is going on? And then I see the Sorsby thing. And it was just like, I think I was just sad. I don't know. It was sort of like, it was the first time in a while where I felt like, you know what? Like, man, I get it why people are like, I'm good with college sports. Like I'm done with this. Like this is ridiculous and I'm kind of over it. And like, this is preposterous. And that's really sad. Cause like, I think that like, look, there's a lot of really great things happening in college sports. There's some really great stories. There are really great people. There's a really great product. It's just that stuff like this, I think genuinely like threatens the sanctity of the sport. And I think that like, forget again, like I kind of joked about it, but like, forget that like people are getting creative and trying to skirt rules on how they pay players, and forget that like people are tampering. Like at the end of the day, if you can't say that it's an honest competition, then like what are we doing? Like stop drug testing people at that point, right? Or stop, why are we having referees? Like, it's sort of like I know I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but like it's I think like I really think it's like a real critical like crisis moment. And I think it's really sad because I think that it's the kind of thing that like really turns people off to college sports despite like all the great things happening.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard also, I think, for a lot of college fans who have experienced as you mentioned earlier, the more draconian side of how the NCAA ruled a lot of this stuff. And that was the case originally, as he was declared ineligible for next season because of this. Before Texas, it wasn't Texas Tech that was involved. It was specifically Sorsby, Sorsby's own attorney, from my understanding. Correct? I want to make sure I have that correctly. Yes. And so it was separate litigation from university attorneys and things like that going and seeking the ability for him to be eligible. But I mean, I can understand and appreciate a lot of people's frustration and frankly, just kind of just being over it in a sense. I do understand that. And so it's hard to see, but one thing I want to ask, as we've mentioned, this is going to continue evolving, but one of the things that was mentioned is Nebraska's AD, the day that the ruling had come out that Sorsby was eligible, had gone out and said that, the Nebraska does not have a desire to schedule Texas Tech. anymore because of this. And is there any way that other schools or conferences could do something about that? Is there anything that Texas Tech could do to change that? I know there's been a lot of back and forth, but how much validity is there to all of that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I spoke with Troy Dannon from Nebraska not too long after this ruling came out, and he was certainly among the folks who was not thrilled about the situation. And I think that look, I think that's possible. The Big Ten came out. I believe it's been reported by a couple of people now at this point, but the Big Ten is not going to ban its schools from scheduling Texas Tech. But I think there are a lot of schools around the country, even if there's not a formal ban, I think there's a lot of schools that are like, yeah, we're not scheduling them. That's ridiculous. I talked to one administrator today who was like, look, there were 360 schools in Division I. And there's one school in America that would have dealt with this the way that this is being dealt with. And that's, alluding to Texas Tech. And so I think there's a lot of hurt feelings. I think too, the thing that's interesting, and I think it sort of plays into what you're saying, is that there's a lot of people who've been frustrated with Texas Tech already, right? People were already ticked off that Texas Tech was spending a bunch of money and sort of buying their way into the big time, for lack of a better term, and trying to be, win. That's one thing. I think that a lot of that is just grandstanding, and some of it's coaches just being annoyed that they don't have the resources that Texas Tech does and whatever. That's just kind of the way that life works. I think the thing that's more interesting, and I think becomes a really fascinating dynamic as you look forward, is Texas Tech going to alienate itself from the rest of the entire system by operating the way that they are with this? So I say that to say, there's probably not going to be a super league tomorrow. Maybe it's not a year from now. Maybe it's not 5 years from now. But with the way that Texas Tech has operated on this, I don't think it's crazy to say that whenever that split happens, that Texas Tech is not part of that club because of this. And I think that you look back, and it's sort of recent history, but Florida State and Clemson, there are people I still talk to around the Florida State and Clemson stuff that, if Florida State ever wanted to leave the ACC and go elsewhere, there are leagues that are yeah, we're not doing that. We're not welcoming that into our league over the way that they handled that thing. And so I think you're going to see something similar, I think, with Texas Tech. And I think there's something to be said of, again, I have no issue with Texas Tech spending a bunch of money. If they want to do that and they can do that, awesome. That's great. I think that is just the reality of the world. And it's really just people complaining that they don't have the same resources. I think this is a different thing and a step too far for a lot of people. And I think that's why it is something that I think ultimately in the long run might actually really hurt Texas Tech. And I actually think for all of the good that they've done by spending money and winning and all of those things, this may actually in a backdoor way sort of kick them to the curb.
It's an interesting perspective to put on this as well, when you start looking at bigger picture things, and with going back to the legislation, who knows what's going to happen with that, how that's going to change. We don't know what the next 3 months are going to look like. We don't know what the next 4 years of college football could look like. So it's certainly an interesting perspective to have when you look at the broader scheme of things. We've talked a lot about more of the football side of this. Let's flip a little bit more towards the basketball side of things. The NCAA is expanding March Madness, despite a lot of people not being the biggest fans of it. Personally, myself, I don't think it's terrible in the grand scheme of things, but I also can't sit here and say that I didn't prefer the other format a little bit more. But let's just talk about it in general. First off, are you a fan of it, or are you not a fan of it, and why?
I'm less of a fan of it than I would. I think it's expansion for the sake of expansion. I don't really think it moves the needle. That's my personal view.
Yeah, I think I'm around that same feel. I think there's a couple things like the seating and stuff, and you just end up. I believe if I've always been a believer, if you win your conference tournament, you should not have to play a game. That's my opinion. And I understand there's strength of schedule of conferences and all of that come into play. And the selection committee is a job that I could never do in my life, for any sport for that matter, not just basketball, but football, all of them. But that's just how I've always viewed it. That's my own personal opinion here. But with March Madness expanding, how are we going to see this impact college sports moving forward? Again, broad question, but that's part of your job here. So
yeah, no, I think there's a couple of levels to it. I think that One thing that I think is interesting, and I think this is part of the pitch for why expansion and sort of funding so there's a couple of intricacies here. So it's important to note that like TNT and CBS, which own the rights to the March Madness tournament, the men's basketball tournament, technically under the terms of their contract, as it has been explained to me, is that they don't have to pay more essentially for these new games. Like it's effectively written into the contract. Like just because you're adding new games doesn't mean they need to pay more. So the question would be, okay, if the NCAA is going to add games, like how are they going to be made whole on the fact that they need to pay to put these games on, right? Or like what they're worth. So the way that that's happening is sort of that the NCAA is really strict about the way that it runs its sponsorships. So CBS and TNT actually sell sponsorships for the NCAA, not just for March Madness, but across the enterprise. So that's for the, everything from March Madness to like the men's golf tournament to like, gymnastics or whatever. Like those
It's
are
why
sold.
we have to. It's why we have the Powerade cups when you sit courtside for March Madness, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And that is sold in bulk. So you can't, for example, like generally speaking, like if I'm whatever Gatorade and I want to sponsor just the men's lacrosse championship, I can't actually do that. I have to sponsor all 90 whatever championships. Like it's basically buy one, sort of one size fits all. You have to buy all of them. There's a lot of people that would tell you that the NCAA is losing a ton of money because of that, because they're not bringing in sponsors on some of these smaller sports in places where they probably would be able to bring in, say, like title sponsors or presenting sponsors or things like that. So as part of the expansion, there has been some changes in the way that the sponsorship categories are going to be allowed. So, for example, the NCAA is going to start selling beer sponsorships, and I think beer and seltzer and wine maybe. But alcohol is going to be allowed to be sold as a sponsorship category. There's going to be some changes to like regional sponsorships. So like, can you sell stuff in like sort of regional sites and things like that, if I'm not mistaken. So that's sort of how you're going to be made whole on the fact that you're adding, X number of games, which is interesting. Like that's an interesting piece. I think the other piece is one that you brought up is that like, you're going to have now everyone from a 13 to a 16, I think, is going to play effectively a play-in game. That is one extra unit that those schools and those conferences can earn. So that's not nothing. It does allow you to, in theory, generate more money for your conference or your school or whatever by winning those games. It gives you that opportunity, but I do think it's a little bit square peg round hole, at least in my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it makes sense, and certainly there obviously a lot of the grand scheme of college sports comes down to money. That's just point blank period. That's factual. That's the modern day of college sports that we live in. But it's interesting to hear the puzzles have to fit, especially when they do decide to do these major changes like an NCAA tournament expansion, like a college football playoff expansion, things like that. So as we keep talking about this, I'm gonna ask you this, and this is very much pointed a lot more towards Iowa fans here. But it was announced earlier this week, on Monday, that the University of Iowa is seeking approval for a massive renovation of Carver Hawkeye Arena, where the Hawkeyes for men's and women's basketball play, for where men's and women's wrestling compete, and where gymnastics competes as well. In the grand scheme of, again, money rules all in college athletics, but in the grand scheme of where Iowa fits in the Big Ten, particularly more so on this basketball side, this renovation that has been something that Iowa fans have wanted for a while. They just bought the court from the Houston Regional and installed that into Carver Hawkeye Arena. What can a renovation like that do to impact Iowa's stance in the Big Ten, and even just as a Power 4 school?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, I think that like it certainly, and I don't know all the intricacies, but like you look at like what Iowa State, for example, is doing with Town. That's something that the school is going to be able to generate a ton of extra revenue off of. As it relates to stadium projects like Carver Hawkeye, like look, if there's premium seating being put in, that's more money into the school's pocket that can help fund its rosters, its whatever else is going on, things like that, right? I think that, I think the other part of this, and most coaches would tell you this, most ADs would tell you this, is like it's not an and or. So when it comes to paying players and creating, first class facilities and things like that, it's not an and, or it's not an or proposition. It's an and, right? Like you need to do both things. And I think that yes, like the functionality of facilities has changed, in that like yeah, there aren't like waterfalls in locker rooms and stuff like that in the way there were, 5-10 years ago, right? But I do think like you still have to have facilities that are up to snuff and are in the sort of upper tier. And so I think that like it's a really hard balance that schools are trying to strike between like what they need to spend money on and what generating revenue. Like the point is like there's certain levers that schools can pull to generate revenue. Stadiums are one that they use, but not all year round. So is it concerts? Is it more premium seating? Things like that. Like that's what you're seeing schools really chase after right now, as it relates to renovations. And I would imagine that Carver Hawkeye is going to be something similar.
And that makes a ton of sense. Field hockey is also one of those that is another project that the University of Iowa is seeking approval for, putting in a formal field hockey facility on Grant Field. That was also part of the announcement on Monday, but the Carver Hawkeye Arena one is the one that caught a lot of people's attention, and understandably so. Like that is a huge part of Iowa athletics. Field hockey is extremely successful in the Big Ten for the university, and the facility will certainly aid with that. But you also you look at Iowa, you look at the rise that women's basketball has had at the university. Now you're looking at what men's basketball has done under Ben McCollum in his first year. And so one final question I want to ask, and I've asked Beth Getz this before, but from an outside perspective, this is fun to ask too. The Big Ten has done like stupidly well this year when it comes to its national presence. It won the national championship with Indiana in football. I know you're a Hoosier, and I remember texting you during that, and that was a lot of fun to text you during that. And so women's basketball won the NCAA championship. Men's basketball won the NCAA championship. Women's hockey won the NCAA championship. Like you're seeing the Big Ten start to really show prominence on a national stage. What is that doing in terms of the Big Ten's prowess moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it's like, I mean, it certainly helps, right? Like when you're winning, that obviously moves things forward. It's easier to recruit, things like that. But I do think, like, honestly, like I think it's sort of the flip side of that is like it's a microcosm of what this ecosystem has turned into, right? Like I think that for a long time, whether people want to say this publicly or not, like the SEC was a group of schools that was willing to sort of play in the gray in a way that other schools maybe weren't necessarily or weren't to the same degree. Is really probably a better way to describe it. And I think that said, if now everyone can pay players and everyone can activate and everyone can do these things, it levels the playing field. And if the transfer portal, like guys can move, people can move around a little bit, it flattens the curve. And I think that it takes away sort of like this SEC dominance that we've seen, especially in football, but in other sports too. And it opens the door for schools to be a little more open and a little more able to compete. But I think also the Big Ten has adjusted really well, right? Like the Big Ten has the largest TV deal in the country out of any league in America, despite what the SEC, does from a viewership standpoint. Like the Big Ten is bringing in significantly more money every year than the Big Ten is, or excuse me, than the SEC is. And I think that's all manifesting in the fact that their teams are winning right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also not just maybe I guess the major revenue sports like football, basketball, but you're seeing field hockey for Northwestern. They won the national championship. Northwestern won women's lacrosse this year. Penn State won men's wrestling. So you're seeing it at the Olympic level as well. I don't like always saying Olympic because, well, the reality is these sports are all incredible. These are all huge deals, but you're seeing maybe not the major revenue sports, but a lot of these other athletic departments succeed as well. And one of the things that Beth Getz has shared was she basically said, when someone from the Big Ten wins, in a sense, everybody in the Big Ten wins when it comes to the national stage. And you're seeing, as you kind of mentioned, you're seeing this curve flatten a little bit too, and it's gonna make things interesting. I haven't figured out what this next college football season will look like, as we're in mid-June and it's like, oh my gosh, football season's only a couple months away. And who knows what basketball will look like as well. But it is certainly interesting to see how it's evolving.
Definitely. It's no shortage of stuff going on, but listen, now that we live in a world where Indiana football is winning national championships, I don't know if there's any going back. We'll see.
I will never forget getting the text message from you after Signetti's first year, and I just texted you, how are we feeling? And I just get a text message, I don't know how to act right now. It was, of all the conversations you and I have had, that is one of my favorites. Just the pure exhilaration that you have gotten to experience has been so entertaining.
Yes, it's. I watched a lot of really bad football in my 4 years of college, so this has been quite the experience.
Yes. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining. This has been great. I always enjoy getting an opportunity to chat with you. Um, Ben Portnoy has a newsletter for Sports Business Journal that you guys can go check out. I'll let you plug your socials and all of that stuff. So go ahead and plug yourself in here.
Definitely, you can follow the college newsletter every Tuesday night. Or every other Tuesday night right now during the summer, but every Tuesday night during the season. And then at B Portnoy on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now, that site. So I'm easy to find, but yeah, like and subscribe, all the good stuff.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining. If you guys liked this content, Hawk Off the Press has a bunch of fun off-season summer content coming up over these next few weeks as we get ready to start counting down until football season begins. You can sign up for my free newsletter that comes out on now Tuesdays and Fridays. That's brand new for you guys. It's free. You can sign up for that at thegazette.com. You can find the podcast here and a bunch of our content throughout the Gazette. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you next time.